Hello, my name is Joseph Beige. I'm a real estate attorney here on Long Island, and I want to welcome you to today's webcast. For our returning viewers, I want to thank you for all the positive comments I've got, for sharing all these videos, and I'm glad you're finding them helpful. For our new viewers, what we do on these webcasts is very, very simple. With the help of a guest, we discuss a topic or a subject that's related to real estate. And the goal is very simple. We're trying to help educate you so you, the Long Island real estate consumer, can make a better, more informed decision. Now, today's topic on our webcast is going to be a little different than we have in the past. Lately, we've been talking mostly about how to get property, where to buy it, and how to go through that process. Today, though, I think is just as important because it's going to be talking about how to hold on to your property and perhaps one of the worst, most devastating financially and emotionally processes you can go through as a real estate owner, and that's when you're facing a foreclosure. We're doing this video today on the first week of February. Halfway through January, on January 15th of 2022, the moratorium that New York State had on foreclosures ended. That means anybody who's been behind on their mortgage, lots of you Long Island neighbors, are going to be facing a foreclosure. And today, with the help of Ian Wilder of the Long Island Housing Services, we're going to be discussing basically foreclosures, what they are, and the help that's available to people, because there is help available. It's not all is lost. Ian, I want to thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Ian, you have an incredible resume, especially when it comes to foreclosures. And I don't mean to embarrass you, but I can't do it justice. Could you give our viewers a brief overview about your expertise and why they should be listening to you?
I think you're generous. I always joke that when you look back on your life, you can argue that you planned it, but no. Like you, I was a real estate attorney for a dozen or so years. I was local. I did closings, buys, sells. I did things related to that. In 2008 or so, I decided to switch careers. I made an unusual career choice and went to be a housing counselor in a foreclosure prevention program. I started 2009, just as the world was falling apart last time. From there, funding opened up. I went back to practicing law and became a foreclosure prevention attorney. From there, I became program manager of that program. I should say all at Long Island Housing Services, which is an over 50-year-old nonprofit, civil rights nonprofit that focuses on fair housing, but we also provide some housing counseling services. From there, I went to deputy director, and now I'm at the executive director position. So I've pretty much held every level in our agency dealing with foreclosure. And back when I was in practice, as you know, I was dealing with short sales at the time, because in 2008, even before the flood, we were dealing with short sales. So I saw it from the other end. I had, drafted mortgages. I'd helped people. I had given people counseling when they were starting to be in default from an attorney's viewpoint. So I was lucky I was able to come in with that experience.
Excellent. Now, Long Island Housing Services, tell us a little bit about that organization, because it really is a unique organization.
Sure. And I appreciate that. We are a Long Island-focused organization. Our main office at the moment is in Bohemia, but we cover both Nassau and Suffolk counties. We work with people in both counties. The organization was founded a year after the Fair Housing Act was passed. It was founded in 1969, and it has expanded its services ever since. We're probably better known for the fair housing work. If you've heard about the case in Yaphank, in a property development that was a former Nazi summer camp, where you had to be of German descent to buy in. Or if you heard about the case against the former village of Mastic Beach, where they were illegally throwing people out on a couple of hours' notice by abusing the laws. Those were our cases. Most of the cases you'll see in Newsday, where there's fair housing cases and settlements, and the type of testing you saw in Newsday's Long Island Divided article, those cases are mostly ours. In addition to that, we provide, I don't know if you're going to ask me, other services. We have a housing counseling, so we provide landlord-tenant services, foreclosure prevention services, and we have some attorneys with a foreclosure prevention program.
It's a private fair housing advocacy and enforcement agency, which is a mouthful.
Yes.
And even as an attorney, I got to say, I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Sure.
So Can you enlighten us?
Sure. There's reasons for all those words. Private, because we want to emphasize to people that we are not a governmental body. We do not have the ability to make decisions against people. We do investigation, and we do help people bring complaints. In fact, even in foreclosure, they've developed an expertise bringing complaints to New York State Department of Financial Services and the Federal Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Talk about mouthfuls. If the banks are doing things inappropriate. So it's part of our structure. We are a nonprofit. We're a 501c3. Fair housing is the term of art for civil rights in the housing world. It's when you focus on people discriminating because of what's considered a protected class. And there are 3 levels of law. Most people know about the Fair Housing Act in the federal government, which was expanded actually in '88 under Reagan. But there's also state human rights law, and there is county human rights law. One thing we do a lot of enforcement about recently is actually under state law, under source of income. Because if you thought about it, it would make no sense. If somebody has, for instance, a voucher, they actually have a more assured income than someone with a job. People who are working for other people, most people don't have contracts in New York State. They can walk in the office next day and find a box on their desk.
Employment at will.
Yes. Yeah. So if you have a voucher, then you have protections in terms of it can't be taken away immediately. Unfortunately, those vouchers don't work well in the market often, and that landlords refuse to take them, even though they are more assured income than what most renters have.
So circling back now with foreclosures, as I said in my intro, the moratorium is off. And for those of us who are in the real estate, we've seen different analysts and people who watch the market have started to talk mostly from the buyer and seller standpoint about what's going to be happening in the market, because really nobody has any idea about how the COVID pandemic has affected how many people are behind on their mortgages and what's going to happen when the brakes come off, as you will. To people who don't know, they hear the word foreclosure. What really is a foreclosure action that a consumer can expect?
That's a great question, and it's great that you use the word action. When I was doing housing counseling, when I was a foreclosure prevention attorney, part of what I would do, and part of our mission is education. Most people think of foreclosure as a single thing, when the sheriff shows up and tells you to get out of your house. But it's actually a process that can be a long process. And New York State Legislature, the last time we had this problem, put in some protections in that. So it as far as we're concerned, it starts when you are or you know you're going to be behind on your mortgage. Legally, it starts when you're served with paperwork, but that paperwork just starts a process rolling. And I want to say it's best to seek help as early as possible in that process, even when you haven't missed the paycheck yet, but you know you're going to.
That is one of those pieces of advice I think that's as close to universal in law as there is. When you perceive a potential problem or storm clouds on the horizon, seek out help. And finding the right help is why we have you here today.
Yes.
But now, when it comes to foreclosures, I've found with clients, there's 2 things. When a client is not facing, when the general public views people being foreclosed, they're actually a little kinder than the actual person being foreclosed in the way they treat themselves. What are some of the reasons that somebody could find themselves in foreclosure?
There's any number of reasons. The reasons that we see are often loss of employment, which we've seen a lot of, a death of somebody who's bringing in that piece of income that puts you over the top so you can afford to pay the mortgage. It doesn't even have to be the primary breadwinner in the house. It could just be somebody who's contributing. And medical bills, because in my view, we have a terrible system of dealing with medical bills, and that can put you into bankruptcy. That could completely destroy your finances. So any of those reasons end up putting people in foreclosure. Obviously, in this recent cycle and the cycle before, a lot of it was economic. It was loss of income.
And it's interesting, because I did do some, looking up and researching for today. And in the last financial crisis that we had, the suicide rates that have been tied to foreclosures, one study actually had that for every 1% increase in the foreclosures that occurred, there was a 0.4 increase in the suicides related to it, with something of almost 40% of the suicides happening within 2 weeks of a major event, court conference or the actual sale or eviction. So I think it's one of those where I found, and I think you would agree, is that some of the people facing it are harder on themselves. They take it personal. They feel as if they were a failure, and they shouldn't. The only failure to do is to not act. And again, as you said, as soon as they see the storm clouds, they should be reaching out. Now, hopefully they're watching this video. They realize there's help available from the Long Island Housing Services. So if somebody's facing a foreclosure and they turn to your organization, what can they expect?
Okay. I would say the help is even broader than that. Under the New York State Attorney General, there is a whole network of housing counseling and legal nonprofits. It's titled, funny enough, HOP, Homeowner Protection Program. So you can just put that in if you want to search. You can obviously go to us. There's a dozen other housing counseling agencies on Long Island. If they contact us, what they're going to hear is they're going to talk to a housing counselor, and that person's going to want to know a lot of information. Dealing with default on payments is as complicated, in some ways slightly more complicated, than applying for the mortgage in the first place. So they're going to need a lot of information from the person. They're going to have to delve deeply into their finances, because any solution is probably going to require a lot of proof on the other side, whether it's the bank or another entity, for their finances, and the housing counselor has to be able to make the argument.
Now, you bring up the disclosure and so forth. Now, question, and this comes up, clients ask all the time: how much leeway does a bank have? I mean, is it purely in their complete discretion to decide whether to give an accommodation? Are they bound by certain restrictions, laws, things of that nature?
There is, what I found in practicing is they have a great deal of leeway, but they will purposely operate in a very narrow band. And I'll tell you a story. I had a client who had an FHA mortgage. FHA rules can be difficult to get a modification. I think you're going to ask me more about modifications, which is basically rebuilding the mortgage payments so the person can afford it, but the bank gets paid. But this particular servicer, the person who collects the funds, had messed up on their application. Now, normally the answer would be, I'm sorry, you don't qualify because you don't meet FHA. The servicer bought the loan. I was like, you can do that? No one's ever said they can do that. So the answer is, most of the time, there are very strict rules and you're not going to be able to get out of them. The banks do have a lot more leeway, but most of the time they won't go there, and we don't have a big enough lever generally to make them go there. But housing counseling agencies like ours, and attorneys, foreclosure prevention attorneys, know what all the rules are. They know the current rules, and they know as far as they can push the banks. So you're not necessarily going to get a miracle, because we don't have the levers to make miracles, but you'll get the best thing you can get.
When we talk about foreclosures, there's a lot of myths. I'm sure you've had it too. Clients come in with preconceived notions, things that they've heard, things that they've read. The proverbial, my cousin's best friend had situation. And what are some of the more common myths that people facing a foreclosure present to you that you have to say, no, that's not how it is?
Well, the first one is the one we hit, which is the most important one, which is, okay, I don't have to deal with this till I go to court. That's way late. You need to do a lot of planning before that. And there's things you could do to put yourself together. And honestly, a housing counselor can help you do that. I would say another myth, as you say, is that you can get what your neighbor got, and what your neighbor got is something they're describing it correctly, because it can be complicated. It is very, very fact-based. There are actually a number of parties that we're dealing with. It's not only based on your finances and the value of your home, it's also based on two other parties. Most people think they're paying a mortgage and it's like some 1940s movie and they're paying the guy down at the bank and he's collecting the money. Well, you're actually dealing with two parties. One's the investor, and that's who you generally think of. That's the person holding your mortgage. But in between, there's an intermediary called a servicer. And that's who you generally think is holding your mortgage. So you might be getting a mortgage statement every month from Chase, and they act like it's their mortgage. And if you call them, they will act like it's their money. But it could be that Fannie Mae actually holds your mortgage. And unless you're in the business and you know what to read, you don't know that you're dealing with two parties. Why is that important besides being all technical nonsense? Because both sets of parties have rules. And both sets of parties' rules will determine what things you are and are not allowed to do. And it gets more complicated because the servicer is interpreting what they think the investor is saying they can do, which is often wrong, which is why you need an expert to get in between.
Now, I'm glad you said that, because you're leading right into expert, which leads right into my next question. And we were discussing some of these prior to coming on camera today, and that's the vulnerability of people facing a foreclosure. You know, for lack of better terms, I'll call them scams. But there are a lot of illegitimate parties presenting themselves as businesses, sometimes trying to present themselves as attorneys or somebody in the legal process, that are really taking advantage of somebody who's already down. They're already struggling financially, and then whatever little bit they can beg and borrow to get together, they're coming in and preying on them. What's some of the indications for somebody out there that they're dealing with a potential scam when they're looking at a foreclosure defense?
Sure. First, where am I? Don't pay anybody. You shouldn't ever write a check to anybody anytime to get help. There's no need for it. Second, never be told that you shouldn't talk to your bank. You always should be able to talk to your bank. Scammers always tell people, don't worry, you don't have to talk to your bank. We'll do all the talking. Even when we're involved with people, our clients are in touch with their banks. The other thing is when you're dealing with nonprofits like ours, with housing counselors, we are paid by grants. We are certified by HUD. So it's not that our services don't have value, it's that they're paid for elsewhere. So that's kind of why we say we're private, because we want to clear, even though we're being paid by government grants, we're not part of the government. So we don't have the muscle of the government. So you should, and the thing is, if you're behind on your mortgage, any money that you have that you could pay to a scammer should be going to a savings account, because if you have to go in front of a judge, the first thing the judge is going to ask you is, how much do you have saved? Because they want to hear good faith. Even if they know you can't pay the whole mortgage, they want to hear that you can make a plan. And if you can't save anything, then they're not going to believe that you're able to make a plan to make any kind of payment.
And I think a lot of people don't realize that. And that is one of the questions that I know happens. You know, it certainly happens on my tax clients. If they're not paying the mortgage and they're in foreclosure, the IRS or New York State will say, okay, well, where's the money that you are paying them? And, you know, somewhere, you know, unless you can show that you have nothing. Kind of along the same lines.
Shoot.
What is some of the things that people do when they're facing a foreclosure that you wish they didn't do? And obviously this is before they come and speak to somebody, you know, at your services. But, you know, people tend to try to help themselves, and without realizing it, they can make some very big mistakes.
Open your mail. Open your mail. There's important things in your mail. Among other things, and I don't always hand out compliments like this, but New York State did a lot of good things. One of the things they did is when you get 90 days behind, the bank is required to send you a list of agencies like ours where you can get help at no cost. That's in your mail. I know it's hard. And I've had clients who they stopped answering my phone calls. They stopped opening my mail, and I finally shook them awake and said, you know, we have to do this together. The other thing is returning to the same thing I'm going to keep beating on. I beat on everywhere is act as early as possible. It will hurt a lot less. Rip the Band-Aid off. It'll be worse the longer you wait, because the earlier you get to it, the less you owe, the easier it is to make a solution. And in acting, get to an agency like ours who can help you. And we have no personal interest in your finance. Our personal interest is helping you get to a solution. So I would say those are the things.
Now, I know there's a couple of things that once somebody starts with your organization and has some of the options and some of the processes that they go through. One is the plan. What is the plan when a client's going to sit down with you and ask for your help? And somebody says, okay, let's talk about a plan. What do they mean by that?
Well, the plan is probably the second step, because the first thing we have to do is we have to figure out what their monthly budget is. Most of us don't make monthly budgets. We know money's coming in. We know the bills are paid. We know there's $5 left before the next paycheck, but we paid all the bills, so we're okay. No ice cream tonight. So most of us don't make a budget. That's one of the most painful things you have to do. But I'll tell you, it works. I had a client. I liked her a lot. Great client, very artistic. And we sat down and we made a budget. And she's like, oh, I'm only really a couple $100 short from being where I need to be, and I could be okay. And she went out and started doing web design, which she had never done before, but she figured out how to do it, got a job, and she solved her problem. But she needed to see the numbers on paper. She needed to see where the money was coming in, where it was going out, and what the difference was. What we also do is, and that's why I say it's step 2, because it's not only making it, we need to see that the backup documents to make sure we didn't forget anything. You know, you'll see, you'll get a bank document and you'll see a payment to Honda Corporation every month. And the person the cars they're driving are not a Honda. Oh, that's for my motorcycle. Well, we need to know about that payment too, because that's part of your budget. And if necessary, you might not need to think about whether you need that motorcycle right now. And, you know, I hate to say things like that, but it ends up coming down to choices at times. But people can't make choices unless they can lay everything out in front of them. So I would say step 2 is making the plan. And the plan is when we take all the information we got from you, we plug it into who your servicer and investor are and what government programs are out there at the moment. And we come up with what options you have. And then we discuss those options. Because it's so singular, those options are different for every person. And part of it is personal choice. The person may decide, you know what, after seeing all this isn't worth it. I'm better off selling and renting, which on Long Island is not often an option, or moving to South Carolina where my aunt lives and I can rent out a room for her for a while.
And conversely, they may look at it and say, like you said, gee, you know what? I give up the motorcycle for a couple of years. I can save my house and, you know, get back on my feet.
Or I have the ability to bring in this little bit of extra income. If I do this, then I can be back on my feet. But yeah, that's the thing. We talk options with people, and we tell them what those options mean. And when the options have third parties involved, like banks, we tell them the likelihood of being able to get that option.
Now, and you kind of hit on this, but when my question was going to be about documents, and I'm going to assume basically the same advice I give my tax clients when they come in. If you write the check, I want to see the bill for the last 3 months. And things of that nature. Is there a rule of thumb? Like, for example, with my tax clients, is always at least 3 months I want to see.
3 months is good. And also, you need to, what I tell my clients is we end up giving them a list of documents we need. You know, tax forms, bank statements, utility bills. I tell them make a folder and keep putting it in. I'm not doing this work anymore because I can't speak to the banks now, but I'm guessing it's pretty much the same. The banks can be a little slow at processing paperwork, so that 3 months worth of documents get stale and they ask for an update. Well, if you haven't been putting it in the folder, you've got to go chase after your bank to get the bank statement, LIPA, whoever they're called these days, to get your electric, National Grid to get your gas. So the best thing to do is start putting all those bills and all those statements in a folder. And start, even if it's an electronic folder, because everything comes to you in email and PDF, because you will need them, and you will need them until the person representing you tells you you are done, and not a day before, because the bank at any last minute in the process, you could have, and we'll get to an explanation of this, what's called a trial modification, which is what it sounds like. It's a modification with training wheels on it. And they could then say, oh, yeah, before we give you the final document that fixes your mortgage, we want to see one more set of these documents from you just to make sure nothing's changed.
So that way it kind of does track, again, what I deal with the tax and so forth. And when you talk about banks claiming that the documents were lost and not reviewed in time, I did have a short sale with a bank, which I won't name, but that's exactly what they did. And after the third time, they actually, intentionally killed the short sale. I actually looked at them for potential class action because there were some things going on there and reasons why they were preferring not to sell the properties or let the properties go for less than the mortgage.
And that actually goes to a potential issue that people are worried about, which is why it's good to get to a professional. The banks generally have a right to make a decision. Will it be better to cut a deal or take the house? And with the inflated values of the houses right now, that decision might be flipped from where it was last time.
Right,
now,
right. Because if they carry the house as an asset, they don't have to write off the mortgage. They get to carry it as the value of the house.
But houses are not theoretically underwater, worth less than the mortgage at the moment. So theoretically, it might be a better business decision for them, even though they're not in the real estate business. As far as I'm concerned, it's a bad business decision for them to take the house, resell it, get all their money back, and without having to cut off any kind of deal. So there is that potential concern, which harkens back to what I said. You want to see a professional as soon as possible in order to figure things out.
Okay. Now, we did hit on a loan modification.
Yes,
all right.
A couple of times.
So now let's go back a little bit and just clarify what exactly is a loan modification in short.
And I should say a modification is the most common type of solution, but it's not necessarily the only solution. What it is it kind of is what it sounds like. Within certain guidelines, banks may change things in your mortgage. They may extend the period of the mortgage. They may lower the interest rate. They may take what you owe and push it towards the end by extending it. So all those things might happen, and the effect of many of those things might be to lower the payment right now. Or it might just be that you are what I used to call a pothole client, which is you're making a good income, you hit a pothole, and you go back to a really good income, but you can't fill in the pothole. So you can make the same payment, but that payment isn't going to catch you up for that hole. So then you still need the modification so that you can pay off that additional amount you need. And that's one thing, extending it. Now, that said, the banks don't have to do any of these things. And depending on who you're returning to these terms, servicer and investor are, the person you're making the payment to, the person who holds your mortgage, there will be different rules. Because they both have sets of rules. So that's what, and those rules change regularly. Some of it's government intervention. Sometimes it's the banks changing their rules. So you really need to get to a housing counselor to find out what the up-to-date rules are for the mortgage you have and your financial situation.
Excellent. Now, I know the Long Island Housing Services does get involved and provides what they call a limited legal representation.
Yes.
Now, first off, what do we mean by limited legal representation?
It means we're not taking on everything that has to do with your mortgage. The one thing we definitely don't, we have in the past done some settlement conference representation. These days, because of the large number of clients, a lot of it is helping clients prepare for it. Whether we can actually go is different, but we definitely won't be fighting in the Court of Appeals over foreclosure. Why? Because we don't have the resources. So what we do is we focus on the strongest leverage point. One other thing we do is we can help people themselves put together an answer, which is the response to the bank. Sometimes the bank is wrong, or the bank makes mistakes, or the bank doesn't follow the rules in serving you in the foreclosure. And if it is beyond what we do, then we will tell you, you know what, you might want to fight this. It's not something that's our area of expertise or that we have the resources to do. Here's where you should go.
So you somewhat can help somebody quarterback their defense and their of the foreclosure and enforcement of their rights.
Yes, we never tell people we can't help you. What we tell them is, this is what your situation is, and this is, if we can't help you, this is where we suggest you can potentially get help.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned the settlement conference.
Yes.
Just in brief, what is a settlement conference for somebody facing a foreclosure?
Sure. And I apologize. There are terms of art and you get used to saying them. So you're a great host and you hold me on those. Settlement conference. Last time we had a crisis, again, the state government did a great thing, because litigation doesn't work well for the average person. It's great for attorneys like us, and there's all these arcane rules about when you can do things. Like the answer I mentioned, it used to be you had to put in an answer immediately when you got served with the paperwork from the bank. And by the time you actually got a court date, it was too late, which is not the way most people would think about litigation. They would think, I'm served, and when I get my day in court, I tell them why they're wrong. But that's not the way it worked. But the legislature realized there were too many people self-represented, too many people not getting to it until they get their first day in court, which is a settlement conference, and I'll get to it. So they allowed them a second bite of the apple. So you can put in your answer to the settlement conference. Settlement conference is brilliant. It forces the bank to sit in front of the borrower and an impartial person who is the administrative law judge appointed by the courts. And that person is impartial, but they have a role to play. Everybody has to come to the table in good faith, including the banks have to come to the table under state law in good faith to try and work out a solution that works for both parties. So if the bank's getting 19% interest, then they can't insist, no, I'm going to get, and no bank gets 19% interest. They're not going to insist that, no, I need to get my 19% interest and no deal. Because the administrative law judge there would basically be saying, no, that's not how it works. You don't need to get that much interest. You need to get a business reasonable amount. So, but they also hold them to the rules. And I was actually in a case, and I had actually someone training with me, and we went there. And we have tools to make sure the things the banks are supposed to be doing, they're actually following all these steps. And I came in and I said, no, my client qualifies for this modification because this, and this. And the bank attorney was there and somebody from the bank was there, which was unusual because the person from the court required them to be there. And they said, no, they're not. And I had my printout of how it works. And I handed it to the person from the court. And they turned to the other person. They said, well, why is this wrong? And they said X and Y. And to the credit of the person from the court, they pulled out the printed manual the bank is supposed to follow, slapped it on the desk and said, show me. And I thumbed to the page and I said, this is how it works. So they without that person there to hold the bank to account, to do what they're supposed to be doing, no more, not cheating them, not making them accept nothing for their money, but making them make a fair deal. It doesn't work. And our economy would have crashed, and there would have been too many people out of houses, and all our houses would have been worth nothing because everything would have been in foreclosure.
Now, again, I'm going back to what we said about with the plan and having your documentation. I guess that all now circles back to that settlement conference, having all of your ducks in a row and makes it so that you're there in good faith. So if a bank says, we think that you as the person being foreclosed can pay X dollars, you don't just sit there and say, no, I can't afford it. You've got to be able to show, here's why I can't afford it. Here's my documentation. Here's what my health insurance costs, whatever it may be. So
Yeah, exactly.
It all circles back, and it all comes back to, again, attorneys love paper, but it goes back to documentation. So excellent. So if I had to sum it up, I'm going to say the two pieces of advice that you gave, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ian. Number one, do not ignore anything. Jump on it. As soon as you think you might be running behind or may miss a mortgage payment, that's the time to start evaluating it. And then save your paperwork, get all your documentation. Everything's known. You can't hide a payment. You can't say, I didn't want anybody to notice where that money was coming from in terms of W-2s or in terms of your expenses. Ian, I want to thank you so much for being here. I'm sorry.
I'm going to add to that. Call a housing counselor once you know you're going to be behind.
Excellent advice.
So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. I asked you to correct me if I was wrong, and then I kept talking.
That's okay.
That's what happens when you put two attorneys together. We didn't know, that's actually the real reason why they were judges, to shut the two attorneys up. Anyway, Ian, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to be here today. Again, foreclosure is not the most friendly subject. It's not the nicest, but I can guarantee you there are your neighbors and friends who you may not know are going to be facing it coming out of this pandemic. Please, it's not just financials. The studies have shown suicide rates go up. This tears families apart. Share my webcast, not for my sake or even for Ian's, but for the person who you may not even know on social media who may read it, see it, and realize there is help. There's always help. There's always something that's positive that can be done no matter how bad the situation. Ian's information will be at the end of the video. Please reach out to the Long Island Housing Services or any number of the housing counselors that are available for you. Watch out for scams. Unfortunately, we don't want to make a bad situation worse. Ian, again, I want to thank you so much for being here. I think this is probably one of the most important webcasts that I've done to date, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.